Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shelf Life. This is Simran, and this is my podcast, Shelf Life, where we talk about books, their philosophies, but most importantly, our personal relationship with a book. And by the time we record this, it is already the first week of September. We are in officially the last leg of the year, and we're going to be done with it quite soon, which is a good thing. And while I'm here in Mumbai, it hasn't been raining too much, and it's actually starting to die down a bit. The sun's coming out again, and a lot of pleasant days ahead. And I'm starting with this because I wanted to, as our listeners and people who keep coming back to our podcast every week, I wanted to let you in on just the sites that I've been seeing, what I've been experiencing throughout the week, and I want to know. I would be more than happy to know about the places that you come from and where you are living, and if you're living there temporarily during the coronavirus pandemic, or even besides that, if you stay there permanently. I would love to know about where you come from, what you experience every week, and yeah, that could be something that we share. And I also wanted to talk about just nature again, because I wanted to circle back to something that we have spoken about on this podcast before. We have spoken about nature and the impact that it has on writers, on readers, on the difference that reading a book in a particular place at a particular time makes to the experience, to the overall experience. And it's true. I mean, I especially remember all the books that I've read while I was traveling. Even though those books didn't really have much to do with traveling, I have a very vivid image of, where I read that particular chapter, or I connect it somehow to the place that I'm in. For example, I remember I was reading this book by Rohinton Mystery, which was A Fine Balance. Again, if you haven't checked him out, go ahead. He is a phenomenal writer, and A Fine Balance is one of those books that will really I don't know how to put it. It's extremely depressing, and it will make you cry for sure. And you think that you've had enough of the sad elements of the book, but he just keeps giving you more, and you don't even complain because it actually makes a lot of sense, and the book is written so well, the stories are just structured so well, and you get completely absorbed in the world. But anyway, that's besides the point. I read A Fine Balance, which was my first Rohinton Mystery book ever. I read it when I was traveling, when I went to, I think it was Missouri. Yeah, I went to Missouri, and I read that book while I was there. It wasn't a very long stay. Went there just for a couple of days, but I remember that place so much more vividly because of that book, and because of the entire journey of that book. And I tend to read a lot when I travel, so I think if you're someone who reads a lot or who likes to read, or even if you want to pick up reading, I would suggest that you do it when you're traveling, because I think it adds a very specific flavor to the book and to your experience of being in that place as well. I think you take a lot from wherever you are. You find a lot of things similar or not similar, whatever it is. It's an experience that you should be familiar with. So I would suggest that, reading while you're traveling. And keeping that in mind, we have our book for this episode, which is Michael Ondaatje's Running in the Family. Now, a lot of you might know Michael Ondaatje because of The English Patient. It was a Booker Prize winner book, extremely acclaimed, wonderfully written, and it won a lot of awards. It's been made into, movies and shows and all of these. There's so many different adaptations to it. And it's a really, really good book. And I've read it, and I read it a while ago, but I'm going to be very honest. I didn't really understand much of it. I thought, obviously, I know that the writing was superior and it was something that I aspired to, but I couldn't really grasp everything that he was talking about and the way that he spoke about it. But that's, again, we're straying from the point. We are going to be talking about Running in the Family, which is actually about it's different from the stuff that he usually writes, from the poetry that he writes, from The English Patient, anything else you might have read. This is a family memoir, and it's a book that specifically talks about Michael Ondaatje's family and his history and the experiences of his parents and his father and his grandmother and grandfather and aunts and uncles and everybody who lived in Sri Lanka, because he is a Sri Lankan Canadian writer. And it's a story about how, he travels back to Sri Lanka just to trace back elements of his childhood, to go back to the roots, as you may call it, to understand where he came from and why he is. And it's a really beautiful book I think, this kind of concept is something that we see so often. The books where the hero goes to his homeland and, he has this the return of the prodigal son and whatnot, that kind of story. And you have so many stories like that. You have so many films like that. And it's a very interesting concept that's been done many times, and it can become a very common cliche. But I guess if you have someone like Michael Ondaatje to write it for you, I don't think there's any scope of it becoming a cliche or becoming extremely stupid or any of that. So I feel like you will realize just how wonderful this book is if you read it as well. Flashback a little to the last episode that we did with the amazing Mansi Hegde, and thank you so much for all the love that you showed on that episode as well. I really appreciated the feedback. I read all of it, and in fact, myself and Mansi, both of us, really, really appreciated all the feedback. Thank you so much. And moving on, flashback to last episode, and if y'all remember, if I can just jog up your memory a little bit, Mansi read out a poem in the beginning of the episode. She read out a piece that she wrote, and we went on to talk about it a lot too. We talked about that piece and about how writers essentially write so much about where they come from and what they know. Writers tend to write so much about the world that they live in and the world that they experience every single day, and they find the magic in the ordinary things, in the things that people who are not writers would probably take for granted, right? And building on that thought, I think this book is, a testament to that statement. It would stand true and pure to every word that is being said in that statement. This book is about how an ordinary family, who's not really very ordinary, they have all these stories and they have all these experiences and they have all these people who could easily be, characters of a film and just characters of a novel that you keep going back to, who could very easily be these strange characters, but they build, they are such important elements of a beautiful story. And so much of it connects to the place that you live in. So much of it is actually impacted by where you are in that moment and where you've lived and where your parents have lived, where your roots are, where your history is. And we talked a lot about that. And, I just want to, since we're doing this episode on family memoir, and we're doing an episode on just roots and history, I wanted to get you all into my roots and my history as well. Since that's what we do here at Shelf Life. We pull you all into stories that you might not know, and we hope that you like it. And we hope that you can connect to it. And maybe even tell us your own stories, right? So I'm going to pull you into mine. Now, this is something that you already know about me, right? That I am South Indian. My family originally comes from Mangalore, which is in Karnataka. And both sides of my parents come from their we have relatives who live in the village still, and like they have an ancestral house and everything. And even though my grandparents and their parents moved to Bombay quite early on in their lives, there's still a very strong connection to where they came from. And it's more than just sharing that language, which also, again, is a very, lingo version of it. It's not really authentic, but it's all right. We accept it. It's still that language. And so that's the kind of family that I come from. And I think even though we live in Bombay, even though most of my family now lives outside of the village, I think all of us are intrinsically South Indian, and we carry that, not always with a lot of pride, but with a lot of significance and weight. And we know the history of where we come from, and most of us do. Most of us accept it, most of us try not to, but at the end of the day, it's still there, right? And if you know anything about South Indian families, I don't know how many of you do, but if you know anything about South Indian families, and Michael Ondaatje talks about this as well, because he is Sri Lankan and his family is Sri Lankan, and they live in erstwhile Ceylon, right? I think that's how it's pronounced. I'm hoping. And if you know anything about the South Indian community, you would know that there's a lot of peculiarities, right? There's a lot of eccentricities. And Michael Ondaatje says this. Eccentrics are the most irritating people to live with. That's a quote from the book. And it's true. There's a lot of eccentricities. There's a lot of peculiarities. There's a lot of weird things that we do. And there's a lot of difference in terms of the way men live their lives, in terms of the way women live their lives, and in the way they perceive the world as well. In fact, I want to tell you all a really, really beautiful quote from Running in the Family. And this is when I read the book, and I read this quote, it stayed with me so strongly. And I remember this. I was so taken aback because I always had this dream about being able to sum up my entire family history or my whole heritage or everything, whatever it is, sum up any emotion or any thing into one quote or into one poem. And I mean, I agree that it is kind of the tragedy of my generation, probably, that we are so obsessed with trying to sum up things into something shorter, instead of letting it stay the way that it is, letting it stay as long as it is, as dense as it is. But anyway, I was obsessed with trying to sum up my whole heritage or whatever into one quote, and I could never manage to do it. I still can't. But I came across this one quote by Michael Ondaatje in this book, and it made a lot of sense to me, and I really, really, I love it. I still love it. I still go back to it a lot, and it really helps me write a lot as well. And I'm going to read the quote out for you. An intricate tribe of wild women and soft-hearted men who were obsessed to the point of dementia with their honor. And the reason I like this quote was because I think I could probably describe every person in my family that has ever existed and that continues to exist. I could describe them in this, with this quote. We're just an intricate tribe of wild women and soft-hearted men who are obsessed to the point of dementia with their honor. And I don't mean it in a very negative way. It's not negative at all. In fact, I think it's the most human thing ever written. And there's so many human aspects to it, right? There's so many human aspects to my family. There's a lot of humor, there's a lot of dark humor, there's a lot of secrets, there's a lot of love, there's a lot of tempers flying around. And there's also this one thing that I noted down that even Michael Ondaatje talks about in Running in the Family, that there's usually always some one thing, some weird thing that is very specific to your family history and to your own family and the way that you all do things. It's very specific to you guys, but it's not always honorable. It's not always something that you probably want to admit to. And that thing could go beyond just your family. It could probably go to stretch on to your community, or to just the place that you live in. It could stretch on to a lot of things, but it essentially starts with your family. So he talks a lot about that in Running in the Family. And of course, I'm not going to tell you what it is for his family because I want you to read the book. But I can tell you what it is for my family. And I thought about this a lot. And I realized that one thing that transforms into either a pattern or a habit or a lot of different things, that dilutes into a lot of different things, and becomes us in our whole entire form. That one thing that can be traced down to generations is frugality. We're actually quite frugal. As weird as it is, we actually are. I mean, it doesn't come from this need to, just save a lot. It's not intrinsically that. It's not that we have less so we need to save more. It's not that, but it's just like, it's almost like a reflex. It's ancestral reflex, if I had to say it like that. Everybody in my family, everybody who's ever lived, has been quite frugal, and I think it has something to do with the fact that probably many years ago, I think this is the time of like my great grandfather and stuff, probably didn't have much, right? Like most people at the time, and probably had to struggle a lot to get where they wanted to get, and finally most of us, touch would be are, but I think that never really goes away. That kind of becomes a part of who you are. And there's this really funny story that my mom told me not a long time ago about how my great grandmother, so my mother's grandmother, she had a lot of kids, and if there was any kind of festival or anything at their home, she would invite, of course, the relatives and the aunts and the uncles, and there'd be easily around 15 people in the house, right? And of course, if it's a festival, there'd be sweets, but there's not enough sweets for everybody. So what she would do, my great grandmother, is that she would take each piece of whatever, maybe it's barfi or it's some kind of peda, and she would cut it down to smaller pieces, and then each person would get that one small piece, which is how they would divide it into 15 people to feed 15 people. And I don't know, I find that such a funny thing because it is time consuming. It takes up a lot of time, a lot of energy, and I understand how that could transmogrify into an internalized belief and get passed down through generations, where even I do that. I mean, even I was taught to always share with my sister, no matter what, even if we had enough for the both of us, if there's anything, we had to share. Each of us had to share, and there was no question about it. So this is something that I want you to think about, What is that one specific thing about your family that is just specific to you guys, and something that has been passed down through generations? It's that one abstract quality that all of you might have had, that your grandfather must have had, you have, your parents have, and even though you don't consciously adopt it, it is still there. It is a part of you. And what is that one thing? I'm sure you have something. So I want you to think of that, and write to me. Tell me what it is. I would love to know. And I could, get you guys on the podcast as well. I could talk about your stories if you want, and that would be beautiful. So we could do that. And moving on to, a lot of peculiarities of the South Indian community. Of course, we talked about, the community as a whole. We talked about families. let's go deeper than that, right? Let's talk about individually the men and individually the women, and then, the way that they were. So the women, most of the women in my family at least, came with a lot of love, a lot of secrets, a lot of dark humor, a very wicked sense of humor for sure. They had the ability to make light of any situation, and I mean anything. And that, it passes down right from my grandmother to my mom to me. Me, not so much, but my sister definitely. And it just, it's something that's there. And there's, of course, I've talked about this before, there are also wonderful storytellers. All the stories that I know have come from my grandmother's aunts, not uncles, but aunts, and my mom, of course. So the women came with love and stories and humor and a lot of secrets. The men had their own love stories. Mostly it was with liquor, which is not a bad thing, but yeah, there's been some famous and infamous men who drank, who didn't. There hasn't been any who completely abstained from it. If I had to really look for any, yeah, there really hasn't. And I guess that would make sense, because it would be a very weird sight to know a South Indian man who didn't drink. So that would make sense. And the men also had a lot of solitude, very soft spoken most of the times. Didn't always love company, didn't always prefer crowds. At a party or at any function, it was never the men who made the most amount of noise, it was always the women. So the men quietly would, reach out to a corner and just stay there, indulge in the food, have fun with the liquor or the food or whatever it is. They were their softness, but keeping in mind their softness, there was also a sense of ego. It was almost as if their softness was bruised by a burdening ego. They were a product of their conditioning before they were products of nature. They became men before they became human, almost. And of course, with the men and women both, there were always dreams. There were always stories of premonitions, about dreams, about so many just unexplainable things, right? And I'm not sure if the men told a lot of stories. I've not heard any from any man, but it was usually at funerals when the stories would come out. And it's a very beautiful thing, because even Janice Barriott, and we've done a book on her, we've done Boats on Land, she talks about this as well. In her community, it was mostly at funerals that they told stories. They would gather around and they would talk about the dead and those who were gone, and they would laugh, they would delight. It wasn't a sorrowful thing. And I get that, I understand that, because as long as I've known any death in the family, at funerals, of course, there's the food, the very bland rice and green chutney that they give you, and they expect you to eat it without any kind of preparation. But there's the bland food, there's the no meat, there's the all of that you observe. But there's also, sitting together, and the stories, and the laughter, and the ability to find something happy even at a time when there's not much to be happy about, right? There's also this belief that history keeps repeating itself, that there are mothers who pass down a lot of things to their kids, and the kids become their parents. There are stories about aunts who essentially never married, but still passed down a lot of their qualities to the next generation. There's so many stories about even reincarnation, funnily enough. But yeah, there's a lot, and that reminds me of a really wonderful Mark Twain quote, that history may not always repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And I really like that quote, and I think that works with, I guess, our families, right? And running in the family, everything that I've talked about just now, running in the family is essentially that. It tells you the story of one family, and it traces back to Michael Ondaatje, but you is essentially talking about his parents. He starts there. He travels with his sister back to Sri Lanka after a very long time, right? And he goes to his aunt's place, and he just sits with her, and she unfolds the past before him. She pulls him into his own history, his own past, and she tells him about his parents. And it's so strange because in the book, you almost feel as if Michael Ondaatje doesn't know his parents, right? His parents' names are Mervyn and Doris, who led quite eventful lives. Again, they were also very, very wealthy, very, very, what's the word for it? They were just this, their family was almost like a hub of debauchery, and everybody indulged in all sorts of self-destructive behavior, but they had a wonderful ride. There was a story that had almost everything. It was like right out of a book, out of a novel. In fact, I want to tell you this, like before, I'm not obviously going to tell you all of the stories, but I can leave you with this, that when Michael Ondaatje, his father, Mervyn, goes to Cambridge to study, and he is sent to Cambridge by his parents to study. But what he does for 2 years is that he uses all of his tuition fees to host expensive parties and to have a lot of wine and a lot of liquor, and he just spends all his money, and his parents, they're absolutely furious. They travel to Cambridge to confront him, and he retorts back by getting engaged to an English woman whom he does not know. And that's how it starts, and his parents are obviously pissed. But he then breaks off that engagement and gets engaged quite, right after that to Michael Ondaatje's mother, again, someone that he didn't really know very well. And it all happens just like that. And there's no explanation. There's no time for an explanation. There's no time for a reason. There's no time for anything. And that's how most of the stories in Michael Ondaatje's families are. They happen in the heat of the moment. They happen through outbursts. They happen without explanation, without reason. And most of the times don't always end well. But they still happen, and they make for good stories, right? So I think maybe that is enough. I don't know. If it makes for a good story, is it worth the pain and the effort and all the things that you might have to go through to get there? I don't know. Maybe you can, we discuss that later on. But Mervyn and Doris, Michael Ondaatje's parents, are described to have a very, very complicated relationship. It's beautiful in the sense that they share this kind of understanding. They share, again, like I said, with most of the South Indian families, they share this sort of dark sense of humor, and they understand that humor. They speak in that, their language is that humor, and they speak through that. And whatever they converse in that same tone. But it goes beyond that. There's, of course, a lot of problems, a lot of individual problems, about how they drank a lot when they were young, and they couldn't stop when they were older. And that reminds me of a Janis Perrier quote again, "The young drink to die." And there's a lot of failed attempts at redemption. There's a lot of trials that end in misfortune. there's a lot of loss, and there's a lot of disappointment that leads to even more alcohol. And it's a cycle that keeps repeating itself, and something that Michael Ondaatje does not want to essentially imbibe, but you never really get that out of it, because probably he feels so disconnected already to his past, and he's just now through this book trying to learn of his past. He probably doesn't really understand it, but he traces that connection, he traces that internalized belief that gets passed down through generations, the one quality that I was talking about. He gets it. He gets that with him, one of those qualities is also that love-hate relationship with liquor, because he also drinks a lot, and whenever he does, he perhaps tells the most revealing of stories, right? And I guess that's a thought that I want to leave you all with, and that's something that's portrayed very, very beautifully in the book. Of course, there's other characters as well. There is the character of Lalla, who is Michael Ondaatje's grandmother, and her story is another one. It's not essentially, it's not completely filled with promiscuity and debauchery and a lot of messing around, but it does have a sense of it has a sense of quietness to it for sure. But again, it has that mischievous element to it, and it has that flavor to it, that mischief, that naughtiness. It has that, and you can't separate any of the characters. You can't separate any of the characters from that. All of the characters are human. All of the characters are messed up. All of the characters have their own things, And in fact, there's a very, very beautiful part in the book about how Lalla dies. And I really don't want to spoil it for you because I want you to read it, but it's the most beautiful way a death has ever been written in any book I have ever read. I don't think I've ever read something as beautiful as that. And I really, really urge you to find out how Lalla dies, because it will move you. And when you read that chapter, it takes something from you. And, moving on, that brings me back to what I spoke about, that most of our families are just, they are just filled with so many stories of weird things, of good people, of bad people, of messed up people, of people we forgive, people we don't, people we hold on to, people we don't, people we can't. There's also so many other elements to it which we completely ignore sometimes, which is the time that they live in, right? The time that you live in also shape who you are. They also shape who you become. And for Michael Ondaatje in Running in the Family, this is so evident, that his parents lived in the 20s, and the 20s were infamously irresponsible and very, very indulgent. And they lived in a time when people partied like crazy. And if you want to know more about that, I suggest you read this book, Beautiful and the Damned, by E. Scott Fitzgerald, if I'm not wrong. And also The Great Gatsby, of course, that talks about the famous 20s. And I suggest you read that because, that really talks about the time that existed, the overall, morality of that time, the overarching morality of that time was so different. And people genuinely felt that they could do anything. And for the most part, they did everything, right? So Michael Ondaatje's parents, all the mischief that they did, all the crazy stories that they had, it seemed quite normal for the time that they lived in. Of course, then the war came in the 40s and everybody had to grow up. Everybody, they started drinking not to be mischievous, not to die, but to live, because they had to live. They started drinking because life became hard and there was nothing else that would make sense. And that's how that pattern of intoxication continued There were people who were intoxicated with liquor. There were people who were intoxicated with love. There were people who were intoxicated with themselves. And that continues, right? And it's very funny because we started this episode talking about how this is, this book, it's a memoir, of course. And Michael Ondaatje states very clearly that it is not a history, but a portrait. And what he means by that is that what you remember of your families, what you remember, the stories that you remember, they're not essentially history. They might not be the truth at all. They might not be even close to truth. But they are memories. And the truth is, at the end of the day, a compilation of people's memories, of many truths and many falsities. It's just an amalgamation of gossip and facts and reflections of the time that they lived in, reflections of the people that they were. It's a lot of things mixed in one, and you can never really tell who these people were. I mean, I have read the book and I still can't tell who the kind of man that Michael Ondaatje's father was or his mother was, even though I know so much about them now, even though he tells us so much about them and what they did and what they didn't do. Their frailties, their disappointments, all of it is traced and written about through aunts and uncles who knew them and whatever stories you have of them, right? But they might not be completely the truth, but they still exist, and that's the narrative we carry forward. And that's something I want you to think about. How much of history is just memory? And how much of memory is just history? And how do you draw the line between the two? Is there a line to draw? Or do you just leave it the way that it is? And that's going to be it for this episode. And I had a lot of fun doing this because this is something that I write about quite often. It's something that I feel quite passionate about. I think we should be preserving stories of our families, stories that have been passed down, because there will be a time when grandmothers and grandfathers and all of these original storytellers, they will pass and they will take all these stories with them. And we will be left to figure out our own ways. And sometimes that works, sometimes it's good, but sometimes it helps to know where you come from and someone who might have done it before you. Because let's face it, history keeps repeating itself, right? Or at least if it doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. So that's going to be it for this episode. And to our last question, why do we think this story was told? I think this story was told because I think I always wanted to ask you. I wanted to know about our listeners, essentially about your families, and what is that one quality, like I said, what is that one quality that has been passed down through generations in your family? And I would really, really love to know it. For mine, I think it was frugality. I'm sure there's more. This is just my one, observation. And I would love to know your opinions. I would love to know what has been passed down through yours, and more about you guys and the lovely audience that you are. So thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to be back next week, and stay safe, stay sunny, and thank you so much for listening. I'm all alone in this